Thank you all for joining us on the social work race again. This is the channel where whatever is happening on the front line of social care, that does, this was really focused on social work, and then it's, I've been thinking about it. We need to include everyone in this. Family practitioners, key workers, youth workers, people working in pupil referral units, teachers, nurses, mental health workers, everyone's included. And it even extends to students. This aims to be a really good resource for you if you are on the front line or even behind the curtains of it all in social care, your experience, your narrative, what you've learned, so that others can learn. So the guests that I have on, I really try to make sure that they can leave us with tools, or their narrative can really empower us. That has happened. So I'm quite lucky in that respect. I know a lot of good people. So thank you for joining us again. Please share. Before we get into it, please share. Please subscribe to this channel, because it helps. It helps people see it, and it helps the channel to be seen. I want to welcome a friend of mine. This lady, she has been there since the beginning of my study journey, even though she's quite a few years younger than me. And she is quite highly educated. So it's a privilege to have her on the show. We've been talking about this for a while. We tried a couple of things once, but it's been years ago, right? But I'm so glad here we are, settled into our careers. Kimberly, welcome to the social work race.
Hello. Thanks for welcoming me.
It's been a pleasure. She can sing, by the way, but I won't go into that now. Yeah, so Kim, tell us what you do, please, and anything else you want to throw on is in introducing yourself. Please go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I am a child wellbeing practitioner, which means that I work at a place called CAMHS. So you will come across that in your studies quite a lot. It just stands for Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. So there's one in pretty much every borough. So basically what I do is that I offer mental health support to young people and parents of children around anxiety, low mood. I support parents of children with behavior difficulties. So it's basically therapies for young people. That's what I do. Oh. That's the main part of my job anyways.
Yeah, CAMHS. So CAMHS. A social worker working with children like myself will regularly be in contact with you, because we have to explore any concerns around a child's emotional or mental well-being. And some of that can be expressed as something being played out in the physical. So they could be self-harming, anything like that.
Yeah.
We're going to be knocking on your door. Before I go into your career, why do you do this?
Why do I do this? That's a really big question, Kurt. I feel like I'm really passionate about working with children and young people. I don't know what it is. I'm just kind of sensitive to it. I just love kids and young people. I really love to see their development when they're young. I feel like that really, really fascinates me quite a lot. And then mental health really just fascinates me for some reason. I can't really say that there was a specific point, apart from, to be fair, when I was on placement, I was doing my university degree in psychology. And I worked in a school for children with, you might have heard of this before, but it's called an EBD school. So emotional, behavioral, and social difficulties school. So it was kids that have been through significant traumas, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, parents been murdered, all that kind of thing. And they had been expelled from mainstream school. So I worked with them for a year. And I think certain people ran a mile when they started on placement there, but I actually loved it. And I feel like that's where my passion really, really grew, working with children and young people, because lots of people will see the behavior on the outside, but I
Yeah.
feel like we need to look a lot deeper for me. So that's what it kind of came about for me. That's why I'm really, really passionate about working with children, and mental health is just my thing. I don't really know. It's just my thing. Yeah.
It's just your thing. That's all it needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know you have a passion for it. We can hear that passion. I'm going to put you on the spot now, though, as if we were enemies and I was trying to sting you, right? Why do CAMHS take so long to do their assessments, to get to the assessment stage? I mean, if I have a young person, and I'm asking this question on behalf of all social workers now, right? We have a child that has significant issues.
Yeah.
And then I make a referral to CAMHS and they're telling me 4, 5, 6 months.
Yeah.
That's no good for us. Why is that? You're on the
I
inside. Let us know.
To be honest with you, the waiting lists are really, really, really long, you know, Kurt. Honestly,
How
at the
long are we looking at?
moment, for an autism assessment at my service, you're looking at 2 to 2.5 years wait.
Pause there.
Yeah, literally.
I
It's
know.
no joke.
Right. So the spotlight's on you. I know it's quite hot under the spotlight right now. Why is that?
Okay, so first of all, just to give some context, I work in a borough called Islington, which is in North London. So Islington is a very, very high need borough. There's lots of deprivation and poverty. There's lots of mental health difficulties. So we're already working in a context where things are already really, really difficult. I think Islington has got one of the highest rates of severe mental health difficulties in the whole of London. So I was looking at some research about that. It literally is a fact. So that's why there's a lot of mental health services in Islington. But if you walk up and down the Angel, Islington, for example, you might not see as much because that's the expensive part of Islington.
Yeah, the glossy
But
part.
if you go further up, Holloway Road, you know, certain estates, there is deprivation all over the place. And just to say, before this job, I was a family support worker.
Yeah.
So I saw a lot, a bit like social work, but a step down from social work. So I was on the streets a lot. I was in people's homes, and the levels of deprivation and poverty that I was seeing was just really,
Shocking.
really significant, really shocking. So a lot of the kids, you know, they've gone through trauma already, poverty, gangs, that sort of thing. So I feel like that's a bit of the reason why the waiting lists are so long with CAMHS. The other reason, I think, just in general, the rates of mental health problems in young people is just getting so high now. You probably see, like, for example, young people messing about with social media, then getting in trouble with the police, and then they're coming to our service because some guy has spread, you know, pictures of a girl to the whole school. I've had that several times now. So it's just getting really difficult. And I think education as well, in school, there's so much more pressures for young people, and there's so much more pressures on schools as well. So I mean, that's a bit of context. I mean, in the world in general, you could say there's a lot of things going on now, to be fair. But
it's a very new world that we're in now, isn't it? It's changed overnight. I think 10 years has seen massive change.
And also I feel like services in general, there's a lot of services that have been closed down, like, you know, like youth hubs and stuff in the community that would support young people just in general, keeping them off the street and stuff like that, and just getting them involved with, you know, activities and stuff like that. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like that's also why the rates are just getting really, really long. So
So it has to be, you know. So can you explain to me, or let's just be clear, 2 years is roughly the waiting list for someone when we're looking at autism. And that means that if I make an application today for a young person because I'm concerned, maybe he's not doing so well in school, he's got outbursts, certain behavioral concerns, and I suspect that he's on the autistic spectrum. So I fill out a form and I send it off. Kim will pick it up. Maybe is it you that picks it up? I don't know how it works.
Yeah, me and one of my colleagues might pick it up here. Yeah,
you'll pick it up, but how does it sit on the list for 2 years? I mean, what is happening?
I think
I know it sounds logical that, sorry to cut you. I know it's logical in that, well, it's just a 2-year waiting list. But if you pick it up, if I send that email up with that document off today, that referral, it goes behind probably 1,000. other applications? And how long does an assessment take?
So, for example, the first stage after we receive a referral is we screen. So we want to figure out whether autism could actually be there in the first place. And then if they meet the threshold for an assessment, then they wait for the assessment. And the assessment itself, over a number of weeks, I think, depending on the child, because then you have to get in touch with the school and other professionals involved to make the assessment, because you have to do like your observations in school and then observations in the clinic as well, try out certain tasks to see how they do with them.
Yeah,
so that
testing.
can take testing and assessments and stuff. That can take a number of weeks, and then we have to write up the report, which can take a while.
So just to be clear, you can't just sit down with someone in like a couple of hours and just work out.
Yeah, no, you can't. Yeah. For some young people, it seems really obvious that they probably have autism, but you still have to go through the whole assessment process. So you have to, you really do have to get in touch with the school and then speak to the parents, speak to the young person. For a diagnosis, the problems have to be present in at least 2 situations. So that's why we say you have to get in touch with the school and the parents, obviously. So if it's present in both of those situations, then we normally say, okay, this child probably does have autism, and then they reach a diagnosis. But if they don't, it could be different factors. But yeah.
And we have to consider as well that the child, there might be delays with the parent might not be compliant, or the child doesn't make an appointment, or the child is refusing to work with CAMHS. I know a lot of young people, they just don't want to know about CAMHS.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. Maybe we need to change the name of it. I don't know. We'll work that out at the end of the show. I don't know. But those can add significant. I've worked with families where the parent just doesn't turn up with the child. The young person just does not care. And so, and then you'll go for another strategy meeting. Well, what's CAMHS saying? That's a statement that's always made. What are CAMHS? Where are CAMHS? What are CAMHS saying? They haven't turned up for their appointment. And it can be 2-3 years, which is interesting. Yeah. So that is the reality of it. And I guess maybe we could do a bit more support funding wise, maybe more staff to just get through that backlog.
Definitely.
Is it a backlog, or is it a fair? Is 2 years realistic? Is that fair?
No, it's definitely not fair.
Okay. So this is really a fun.
I can tell you from now. Right. Okay. So before the pandemic, the waiting time in my service was about a year to a year and a half. And then during the pandemic, we picked up so many more referrals. I literally spoke to a psychologist who's in the team who does the assessments. When did I speak to her? Yesterday. And I said to her, how is the waiting list going? And she said, don't ask.
Yeah.
Basically, it's really, really difficult. And I really, really hate saying to parents, look, the waiting time is 2 years. I absolutely hate it because it's absolutely devastating. They have to literally wait 2 years. And then some of them end up emailing me back saying, any recommendations for private assessments? And I'm like, I'm really sorry, I can't advise on that because I'm NHS and I have no idea anyways. Do you know what I mean? So it definitely isn't fair. I know one borough, which is just outside of London, a colleague told me the waiting time is like 3-4 years long or something. What? I was like, what?
So wait, so if the child is 13, I mean, really, they're not going to be seen until they're leaving school, right?
Until they're 15, literally. Or if a child's in primary school, they're like,
oh man,
10. They don't get seen until secondary school, by which time they're being excluded. They can't make it in because it's too overwhelming. So it's really, really difficult, literally, really difficult.
This is really helpful to know. Seriously. Really helpful to know. I'm taking a pause on that because that is insight. And I guess what you're saying is that different boroughs will have different lengths of time for their waiting lists.
Yeah.
And it can double. And that's just the way it is, isn't it? So
yeah,
in the interim, as a social worker, whilst we're waiting 2 years, if I last 2 years, we then have to work out what we can do in that time.
Yeah.
But it almost looks like CAMHS then is, no disrespect to your profession because we need you, but for some of the young people we're working with, CAMHS is then a tick box. This is a dilemma that it could create.
Yeah.
We've referred to CAMHS. That's all we can do. But CAMHS will not really take effect in this family's life because of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to put a down on it, guys, but this is the reality of the world that we live in social care. On the front line, this is what it is.
And it's really unfortunate because you know what? I think during the pandemic, that has made things so much more significant for families. So, for example, I'm speaking to parents now that are saying, okay, I didn't really see it before, but now that they're at home all the time, I'm seeing it now. Do you know what I mean? But also, what's really interesting, Curtis, though, is that there was a really strong relationship between experience of trauma in early childhood and getting diagnosis of autism. Because if you think about it, some of the behaviors in children with autism are like they can't cope with all the sensory noise, loud noises is too much. They really struggle with eye contact with people. They really struggle to make and maintain friendships and relationships with others. So those are the kind of similar traits that you see in children with trauma as well. So it's really, really interesting. Yeah.
Let's go back. I really want to make this so layman clear about what we're talking about here. So the link between trauma and autism. And if you could just give us a synopsis of what autism is, and then also kind of define trauma with an example.
Yeah. Okay, so autism in a bit of a nutshell, you're mainly looking at 3 components. So you're looking at how they play with other children and how they form relationships. So, for example, when a child is really, really young, you have something called parallel play, which is when children sort of play with each other, but they play beside each other and they don't necessarily share the toys and stuff.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So they're sitting next to each other and they might be kind of like communicating with each other, but they're playing with their own toys and they're not sharing, right? Because they're in their own world. And then as children get older, you have something called reciprocal play, which is when you are playing with each other and you share the toys and you play games together and you're taking turns, you're talking to each other, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But children with autism, they don't necessarily find reciprocal play easy. So as they get older, when they're playing with other children, some of the things that we ask parents to look out for is, do they play with other kids? Because as they get into primary school and secondary school, if they really struggle with that, then that could be a sign of autism. Another thing that we look at is, so the other component is like sensory experiences. So many children with autism really struggle with even just their everyday kind of sensory experiences. What I mean by sensory experiences is noise, smells, touch, you know, even down to like specific textures. And they can be really, really particular about them.
That's the one I relate to the most, to be honest.
So even like going on the street and going to school can be really, really difficult because they really can't cope with all the noises. And so, for example, fussy eating can become a problem because they don't like things touching and different textures and stuff like that as well. And then the other component that I would think of is, well, okay, I've thought of play, I've thought of sensory experiences. And the other thing we think of are things like eye contact, which is similar to kind of like the relationships aspect. So do they have eye contact with other people? What's their tone of voice like? So, for example, lots of children with autism, they really struggle to have direct eye contact. Some children with autism really kind of like have a really monotone tone of voice. There's not really emotions in it, if that makes sense. There's not as much emotional expression. And yeah, they really struggle to understand other people's emotions and states of mind. Yeah.
Wow. It's quite broad, but I
really
get it.
Broad.
Right.
Yeah.
So
that's
it
why
could
it's
be
called
really
a spectrum. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough. It's a spectrum, and so we could just be looking at one thing or multiple symptoms.
Yeah, because some children with autism, they vary to the degree of how they manage sensory experiences, for example, or how they play with other children, for example. But generally, we see those kind of traits. And the reason why it can be difficult to pick up is because some children, especially as they get in secondary school, they tend to mask it quite a lot, especially in girls. So they tend to do a lot of what you call imitation. So it may seem like they're having relationships with others, and it may seem like they're having conversations with others, but they're actually just imitating it to just get through the day. Yeah.
I mean, we can see each other, guys. You won't see us, but we are looking at each other, and she can see the shock on my face. This is deep.
It's really, really deep. So that's why parents are like, I'm not too sure if autism is there. And we're like, actually, we think it could be there. So it gets a bit tricky, but especially as they get older, because the more they get older, the more they mask it, because they're starting to notice that they're different from other young people. So lots of young people come to our service and say, I feel different from others. So then they tend to try and mask it, because friendships in like adolescence is so important.
Yeah.
So no young person likes to feel left out and different. Do you know what I mean? So they end up kind of like masking it and masking their difficulties and stuff. So yeah.
So then you've obviously logically you said trauma. I can see some level of logic. Trauma and autism are linked. What do you mean in practical terms? Because sorry, before you say any more, because you could now be speaking to a parent now, because it looks like parents might be unwittingly, it could be not just parents, but because children spend a lot of the time with their parents, they could be unwittingly causing the child to develop a level of autism. Is that fair to say, because of what they may experience at home? Is that how it works?
Do you know what? It's a really tricky one to entangle, to be fair. I spoke to that same... Yeah, the nature versus nurture stuff. I spoke to, because I literally had a consultation about this yesterday, because it comes up so frequently all the time. And I said, I wasn't too sure, because there was trauma in this child's early life. So I wondered if it was just a trauma reaction rather than it being a trauma reaction and autism, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So I feel like there's probably a lot of research to say, okay, well, autism, the reason why we call it a neurodevelopmental problem is because generally children, for example, with just a trauma reaction and children with a trauma reaction and autism might have different kind of like brain structures, if that makes sense. So, but yeah, it's a really difficult one to entangle, but I wouldn't necessarily say a parent's unwittingly by trauma or like being involved in traumatic experiences or experiencing trauma is unwittingly sort of creating an environment where autism could grow. Autism might just be there anyways, and then trauma just makes it worse, if that makes sense.
So then the question I'm asking you then is, what do we know from what you've researched or studied about the link between trauma and autism?
I think we're still trying to figure it out. If I'm honest, we're still trying to figure it out. I think maybe what I can say is a lot of it is kind of like, you might not like to hear this, but a lot of it is trial and error, if I'm honest. So, you know, a child might
You mean from a professional standpoint?
Yeah, professional standpoint. So
we're still
when I say trial and error, I mean, we know things, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like we're sat here thinking, oh, okay, I'm not quite sure what to do here. But, you know, there are situations where we literally cannot figure it out until we get to the end point. So, for example, if a young person goes for an autism assessment, then at the end, they don't actually meet the threshold for a diagnosis because the assessment is quite thorough. You go through the family, you know, history, development, all that kind of thing, and do the tests and observations. So by the end of it, you might say, okay, this child hasn't met the threshold for a diagnosis, but this child did experience significant trauma in their early years. So then you might go from a trauma standpoint and say, okay, this young person needs therapy. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes we use the assessment to figure out whether it's autism or trauma.
Right. And I guess because the human brain and behavior is so complex, a lot of people are going to be disappointed because there's something wrong with my child.
Yeah,
You need to give me a diagnosis, please. No, I'm sorry,
yeah,
rejected. And that's a complication that
it's
we have.
hard. It's hard. But families live in contexts which are really complex. And like I was saying in Islington, it's a very complex borough and it's very, very high need borough. So you're going to get a lot of referrals for autism, ADHD, experiences of trauma, depression, anxiety, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the kind of whole conversation about autism, it's going to happen a lot. But because these families live in such complex environments, even just thinking about sensory experiences, for example, I was talking about this to someone the other day, and I said, I feel like all of us experience too much sensory experience anyways, especially
Absolutely.
if you live in London.
I'm tired because I'll give you an example. I'll be on the phone, I'm looking at the sat nav, and then I'll start listening to the radio. I'm seeing street lights. I'm looking at road signs because now they've got a new set of road signs where you can't go down certain side roads near schools and you can get a ticket.
Exactly.
Lights, the police come in. I'm on another phone call. I'm having a Teams meeting as I'm going, and I'm burnt out. And I'm thinking, why am I so tired? It's not like I've been to the gym. Do you know what I mean? That's just me.
Exactly.
Let alone the children who are up late on their devices. They go to school.
Exactly.
They're tired.
Exactly.
So, a question for you then is: what when obviously you're in a diverse borough in London? What correlations are you seeing that stick out for you?
Okay.
In your profession.
So one of the main ones that sticks out to me, and again, I'm really passionate about thinking about this because myself as a Black woman, Black British woman, grown up in a Black British household, you're sensitive to certain things, like racism, systemic racism. So one of the things that really sticks out to me is the differences in access rates for young people coming from certain ethnic backgrounds. So what I mean by that is some young people from some ethnic backgrounds are accessing the service more at like certain points in the service. So if I give an example, so just to explain CAMHS a little bit more, you have what's called your main CAMHS, which is, we call it tier 3. So in social care language, that's like, I don't know, child in need level. Would you call it child in need level?
That's where I work now,
Yeah. So it's at the level where it's not quite significant to the point where they need to be taken into care or, inpatient units, for example, but they need something really quite significant, right? So those children, they come and access CAMHS, they come and access therapy, but the main group that accesses CAMHS at that level are your white families, right? So your white British families and white ethnic background families. And then what's underrepresented, so for example, groups such as Black African, Black Caribbean, and certain South Asian groups are underrepresented in CAMHS. What I mean by that is that we're not getting enough at that level. So we're getting loads.
What do you mean you're not getting enough? What more do you want?
So, for example, if you compare it with the demographics in your borough, say, for example, if you're in a borough that has quite an equal amount of ethnicities, it might still be slightly more majority white because we're in England. But if you're in a borough that's it's really diverse, right? But you're still mainly seeing white children come into the service. That's the problem.
So then if you said it's a problem, may I challenge you slightly by saying maybe they don't have a problem as much as the white counterparts?
So this is my challenge, right? It's like the difference that you then see is that when you go up in the service, so you're looking at your tier 4, so social care equivalent is child protection level, that might need to go into care. The mental health equivalent is inpatient units, where they might get sectioned. It means that they are a significant harm to themselves or other people, right? So there might be suicide attempts, suicidal thoughts, lots of aggression towards other people, that kind of thing. What changes there
Wow.
is that you're seeing loads of young people
Minorities.
from minority ethnic backgrounds at that level, and not many kids from white ethnic backgrounds at that level. So the story completely switches. And when I say completely switches, you cannot miss it. Okay, it's in the research and it's in my own experience of working in mental health. It's in, like lots of researchers talk about it now because it's so obvious. Sometimes there's maybe a bit of variation with depending on where you work in terms of what borough, London borough, or which part of England you work in. But when I say you cannot miss it, you cannot miss it. So, for example, in social care, you might have a lot of contact with, say, for example, we call them PRUs, so pupil referral units. Those are where kids get excluded because they can't take it in mainstream, they can't manage it in mainstream, or the mainstream schools can't manage them, should I say. And then they go into pupil referral units where it's kind of like a specialist unit and they're supposed to only stay there for a while, but
they end up staying
some kids end up staying there, basically. Exactly. So basically, what was I going to say? So and then you kind of see an equivalent there with education. So you're seeing it in education, and then you're seeing it in mental health services. So a lot of the kids that go into PRUs as well tend to be, and not even that, right? So
tend to be minority.
Tend to be minority ethnic backgrounds a lot of the times,
Yeah, and not only that.
But not only that, if I add another layer onto that, right? If we think about the criminal justice system, what I will say is that PRUs are a little bit different. I will say in Islington, the PRUs it's a lot of Black and South Asian kids, I'm not going to lie. And then with the criminal justice system, the way how it's all tied up is that if a young person gets sectioned, it usually requires someone like a police officer, a social worker, a medical doctor, right? Maybe all three of those, or at least one of those for the sectioning that are able to section a young person, right? So a lot of Black kids, for example, who end up in the criminal justice system end up in inpatient units because actually what they're experiencing is mental health difficulties.
Oh my.
Does that make sense?
I
mean, if you've got a kid walking around with a knife in his pocket, they're not doing that for no reason, right? They might be involved in GAMS, and maybe the motivation is I'm involved in GAMS and I need to make money and blah, blah, blah. But they're terrified. What is that? That could be depression, that could be anxiety. Psychosis is another thing. I don't know if you want me to get into
hold on. Listen, you're dealing with me. I can only move so fast. I got to dig deep. I mean, hold on. You said a lot there, and you might. We're going to have to obviously have part 2 because this is what you've done. You've opened up a can of worms here. So, what was the last thing we said? I need to get that. The last thing you said was another layer on it, which is
the criminal justice system. So basically, a lot of young people will end up in inpatient units. And it's the same for adult services. It's the same trend in terms of ethnic backgrounds, right? Very, very similar trend. So a lot of young people...
So hold on, I have to summarize. So what? Allow me to summarize because some folk... All right. It appears that maybe native or white people, youth, are addressing their mental health concerns more freely at an earlier stage.
I mean, there's different ways to put it. Yes, it's being identified, should I say?
Now, is it fair to say? Is it fair to say because? Oh, okay. Let's look at this. It depends who they're being diagnosed by.
Yeah, probably, definitely.
And so someone might, I mean, we know this already in some adult studies. I don't know how it is with children, but it depends on who's looking at the child and what they see. Fair enough, that happens. So there is some bias there, not necessarily racism, but definitely maybe racial bias. I don't know, something like that. Okay. But without going down that road yet, we might do that in part 2. So we're looking at minorities not so easy, or maybe not so willing to address their mental health concerns, but at the end, which is not too far down the road for them, they end up being in secure units section because they haven't dealt with it earlier. Is that something fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, I did my master's degree in this. It looked at the relation between culture and mental health. My dissertation, so my thesis, was actually on this specifically. So it's looking at kind of ethnic variations in child mental health service use. So I did what is called a systematic review. So a systematic review is a really good piece of research because it reviews past research. So say, for example, you got one research paper that's looking at one thing, then you got another research paper that's looking at something else similar. Then you got another piece of research that's looking at something similar as well. What a systematic review is, it compiles them together and puts it in one paper to review generally what the general trends are. So for example, with ethnic variations, I was looking at the general trends across the different studies, right? So that's why systematic reviews are so powerful. Policymakers find them really helpful because they don't have time to look at 100 research papers. They might have time to look at one systematic review that just generally summarizes where things are at the moment with that topic, right? So basically, I was looking at the ethnic variations, and one of the things that I find, huge disclaimer, by the way, I was trying to look for, a lot of the studies were actually based in the US, in America.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Which is, I wasn't surprised, if I'm honest, because there's a lot more conversations about race and ethnicity and stuff in America than it is in Britain, in the research world, and just in general. So most of my studies were based in the US, but it did find a trend based on what I'm just saying now. So basically, it was mainly Black youth that were accessing inpatient services a lot more than their white counterparts.
In the UK?
So most of the studies, like I said, were in the US.
In the US, okay.
But actually, some of the studies also looked at kind of like the relation with looking at behavior difficulties as well, which can be related to experiences of depression, anxiety, and stuff like that as well. And then one study did look at, it's what you call a qualitative study, which is basically you do interviews with people, and it's not about stats and stuff. It's more about just getting information from young people and families and stuff. And that study was based in the UK. It was based in South London, actually. And it did find that the parents didn't really want to come into CAMHS for their young people because experiences of like racial discrimination and experience of injustice, those kinds of things. So it was really, really interesting. And it's a shame that there weren't any more UK-based studies. But whilst I was doing my general kind of, so before you get into the main part of a systematic review, you do what's called like a literature review, where you do kind of like a general scope of what's out there in the research. So in that general scope, I was finding a lot more UK-based studies that were seeing quite similar trends, I would say, I think. So, it's really, really interesting. But
wow, you said a lot. You said a lot, because I guess if you work in London, we're going to end up working now on the basis of what you said, a lot more minorities. But like you said, if they have a knife in their pocket, the police will pick them up, take the goods off them, put them in debt. Now there's more stress. Now they're going to be under more pressure to do what they got to do. And that will add to their mental health challenges. They won't want to go to school. They're going to smoke weed to cope. They're going to try to cope by avoiding, which is what adults do too. We do it in a very acceptable way, but children do it by avoiding education, avoiding attention in class. They will stay up late because they don't like to sleep, because they have to think. So they'll play Xbox or talk to their friends or smoke some more weed to go to sleep and
Yeah.
relax and deal with the trauma of it all.
Yeah.
And then we call you,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm gonna meet this, and really there has to. No, let me ask you, what do you think? If you were to say one thing, maybe two, but one thing that needs to change to kind of get a grip on this, and it's not only about minorities. This is just about mental health as well, but. Oh gosh, this is a broad question now. Let me keep it to minorities. What do we need to do? One thing that comes to your
Well,
mind.
I'm going to put a twist in here, right? I don't think it's necessary.
Okay.
I don't think it's necessarily that the young people and families need to change, maybe to some extent, but it's the services that need to change.
Explain.
So the system needs to change, right? The criminal justice system needs to change. The education system needs to change. The social care system needs to change. And the mental health services need to change, right? And I'm saying that louder because I work in mental health and I see it. So when we talk about like systemic injustices, or when we talk about mental health, for example, you have the debate that is, okay, mental health comes from your biology. It's because your brain is wired differently. There's certain chemicals that aren't working properly. Yep. That's one explanation. Another explanation is it's because they experienced trauma in their early childhood. They didn't have the right attachments when they were young. Their parents were going through trauma, whether it's domestic violence or abuse, that kind of thing. So that's created the mental health problem. Another explanation is it's the social context in which we live in, right? So, for example, like what we were saying earlier in terms of just living in London, for example, you might not live in London, but if you live in London, it's very loud, it's very busy, it's already incredibly anxiety provoking. There's a lot of crime, there's a lot of, getting on the train is quite overwhelming sometimes, it's very busy. So that's another explanation. But in past research, it's focused too heavily on the biological side of things rather than looking at the social context. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So if you've got a systemically unjust criminal justice system, that is going to create the problem rather than it being the young person. I'll give you a specific example, right? So if we think about gangs, right? Young people in gangs. If a young person is growing up in an environment that is poverty, right?
Yep.
And their parents are struggling. They've got 3 siblings, right? They're struggling. Parents working 2 jobs. Maybe it's a single parent. I've seen this way too many times. And now the young person meets another young person, and that other young person is like, you know, I mean, you can earn a bit of money, you know.
Let's go make some money. Yeah.
You can make a bit of money. So, of course, that young person is going to be like, do you know what? I'm seeing my parents struggling. She's crying every night. My siblings are struggling. Let me just go and earn a bit of money. Yep. Then it turns into something more because they end up getting reeled into the gang. So if you then say to that young person, I don't think what you're doing is right. It's unsafe. You need to stop earning money. That young person is just going to turn around and be like, yeah, but I'm actually earning 10,000 a week. I'm putting food on the table.
Yep.
And the criminal justice system ain't doing nothing about it. All they will see is that this young person is selling drugs. So they should be put in prison rather than giving them the treatment and the help, or rather than the system around being able to provide affordable enough housing for families to be able to live in and have a good life, right? Because if that young person is living in a different environment and they're having a good life and parents are working, I'm not saying this is, you know, a hard and fast rule. Obviously, there's variations, but if they're not living in poverty, that they might not necessarily have the motivation to start selling drugs and stuff with gangs. So then it's a different story. Do you see what I mean? So,
but that's a fact.
Yeah, but that's a fact. Yeah.
Poverty and crime go hand in hand a lot of the way. I know there are different types of crime, and I know there's white collar crime and so forth.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, when you're looking at low level crime, which is what we're talking about, most so, poverty and crime walk hand in hand.
Yeah, exactly. So then that young person's not going to go to therapy because they're selling drugs and they're earning the money to put on the table.
No time to stop.
There's no time to stop. The therapist will turn around and be like, that sounds unsafe. I'm going to refer you to social services, for example, and so on. But that's why I say the system needs to change. The mental health system, more specifically, historically, I'm going to be, slightly, slightly careful. Yeah, I'm very.
Okay.
I'm sure I talk about it all the time at work. Okay. It's a common thing. But anyway, historically haven't been the most culturally sensitive services, right? So in my service at the moment, what you have, in psychology in general. And this is something that's talked about all of the time because, again, you can't miss it and it's a real problem and they're trying to address it now. But what you see is mainly white middle-class clinicians, psychologists, therapists. So if I'm a young Black boy who's going to a service like CAMHS, I'm not saying this is for every Black boy that feels this way, but I might not necessarily want to talk to a white middle-class clinician.
So you're saying we need more ethnic or minority
we need a lot more
professional.
Definitely.
I get that.
Yeah,
I get that. I find that it is an issue with young people in general, but I would find it more so. Who would I want to talk to? Maybe I'd talk to because it's typically young Black boys in the system, and then again more Black boys ending up in mental health institutions when they're older. Would I want to talk to a white woman? Maybe not. My white man, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, it really depends on the young person sometimes. The research isn't necessarily conclusive on that, but generally, we have a lot of white clinicians who might not necessarily have the same experience as young people from minority ethnic backgrounds in the sense of racism and racial discrimination and stuff like that. So they might not necessarily automatically think, maybe this young person is depressed because they've experienced so much racial trauma in their life. Do you see what I mean? So we're trying to address that now. But can I go ever so slightly deeper? Because I can't miss this. I really can't miss this, right?
Go on.
So when I was studying, and even before that, I think, just a slight background. Psychosis, schizophrenia. I think we all kind of know what that is, but psychosis and schizophrenia is about experiencing hallucinations and delusions. So hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, that kind of thing. Most people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia end up being arrested on the street because they look like, and I'm saying this in quotation marks, they look dangerous to other people, right?
Yeah.
So they end up getting put in prison, and then a diagnosis of schizophrenia, psychosis comes along. This is another thing you cannot miss.
Come on.
The majority of people that get a psychosis or a schizophrenia diagnosis are Black.
Yeah.
You can't miss it. It's everywhere, right? And you can go into why that is, and I know you're talking about part two and stuff like that. We can get into it more then and whatever. But just to give you a little taste, back in the day,
taste of part two, yeah.
Taste of part two, and this can be your test if you can remember this for the next podcast. But okay, so there was a back in the day, I don't know what era, but basically, well, we might call it the slavery era, but when enslavement was a normal thing, basically. There was a diagnosis that came about in mental health services called drapetomania.
Say it again.
Drapetomania.
Drapetomania.
Yeah, drapetomania. It's all one word, drapetomania. You can search for it on Google and stuff. But basically, it was a mental health diagnosis given to people who would run away from their slave masters.
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I suppose that can correlate to why certain diagnoses like schizophrenia and psychosis can be, diagnosed more in, I know it's years on and stuff, but
I mean, this I'm here. My brain is ticking away so fast
Mm.
from what you're saying. I want to address so much. This is why we have to have part two. The whole thing of why do we have a disparity
Yeah.
of diagnosis against
Mm-hmm.
different racial backgrounds? And the question could be asked, is it those who are making a diagnosis, or do these ailments show up more so in these races? It's one of those
Mm-hmm.
questions. And I think you are absolutely right. And one thing that does concern me is that we are bound by a medical model. So when we're looking at the biological
Yeah.
focus of causes,
Mm-hmm.
that means pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And a number of young people I've worked with, they're like, these things make me sick.
Yeah.
I don't like these drugs. There might be of benefit to some children, but a lot of the children I've worked with, they just don't even want to take it. They say it makes me like a zombie.
Yeah. Exactly.
And if you don't take it, or if you go on a panel, they're going to insist you take it. And the
Mm.
parents can't make it take it. You've got to medicate, and it's like, this doesn't work for me. Some children, they just need an environment, or they need a shift in their social, their ecological
Yeah.
environment.
Mm-hmm.
You got some estates. Oh, I've seen some living conditions in 2021. And
Yeah.
I'm like, how do you maintain your mind? Because I never grew up in that. No, I
Yeah.
grew up working class by all means.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
started from a small flat in Putney. They don't exist anymore. That's how bad it was. And we went to another kind of a council house in Clapham Junction. We grew up a little bit, it was quite rough. But the conditions that I'm seeing now that young people are living in, that must be the reason why they are struggling, why they don't want to go home, why they're on the road, and why they struggle, like living in that contained environment with 3, 4, 5. I was in a house the other day, early this year. It was a 2-bed flat. There was about 7 people living in there. And one of them was 3 years old.
Yeah.
So the kids are out on the street.
Yeah. Literally.
So this is complex, but we cannot be dominated by the biological model. I agree with you 100%. We've got to look at this holistically.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you one more question, I guess. Maybe I always say there's one question divided into two. One piece of advice to social workers.
I would say try and look at the whole picture. So
Yeah.
I feel like social workers are generally more, with a young person, you might look at the whole family anyways, right? You do a whole family assessment and stuff like that. But try and see the whole picture. So when you go into the family home, have a think about their living conditions and how that might traumatize a young person, right? So if I give you an example, some of the cases that end up in social care are kids refusing to go to school, right?
Okay.
So they end up in social care because it's a threat to, their future if they don't go to school and stuff. And there might be other things going on like domestic violence and whatnot. So for a young person not going into school, okay, they go to social care, but what's the bigger picture?
Yeah.
You might find out that mom or dad is experiencing depression. So that young person doesn't feel like they can leave their parent to go to school because they're worried about their parent. So yeah, just basically looking at the whole picture. And I would say liaise with as many professionals as you can. So schools, build up a relationship with the young person on a level, because young people they want to talk to real people. You know what I mean? They want to talk to real people that have real experiences. So instead of throwing a lot of questions down, and therapists do this all the time as well. So I'm not saying that this is what social workers do, but just to say that it's kind of like just having a conversation with them. There's a young person that sticks in my mind really significantly. I will never ever forget her. I never really forget a lot of the kids that I work with, really, to be honest, but I will never forget this young person. she lived in a home where there was a lot of, technically it was emotional abuse that was going on. Mum had been through significant trauma, really significant trauma, and I mean all of it. When I say all of it, sexual abuse, physical, the whole lot. Okay. So this young person is growing into an environment where the parent is having a lot of problems with relationships and building up a relationship with their kids. So this young person sticks in my mind because the way how I had to work with her is it took a lot of patience, because when you work with young people, you're really working with the parents.
Absolutely.
So you really got to get through to the parents a lot more than the young people sometimes. But the way I kind of started to build a relationship with this young person is I just started taking her out places. I took her to the youth hubs. We walked to the youth hub. So it was, and then we talked about stuff and she opened up about things. And then she really enjoyed going to the youth hub, and she really sticks in my mind because I just wonder where she's at now. But it's that kind of thing. It's like building up relationships with young people where you actually spend time. A golden tip I'll give for you, actually, if you do work with families, if you work with young people, is...
I was going to ask you what advice to families as well, but go ahead.
Yeah, to families as well as social workers.
Yeah.
If you're trying to build a relationship with a young person, they tend to prefer side-by-side conversations.
Side-by-side,
so
as in physically...
Like if you walk with them somewhere, so you're not necessarily looking at them in their face.
Yeah.
It's a lot less intimidating, and it's a lot more relaxed and stuff like that. So parents find this really, really helpful as well. So parents, if you have a car, if you don't, whatever, if you do like a walk to the shop or something, that's the time when young people tend to open up a lot more. Same with social workers. It was a side-by-side conversation I was having with this young person. We were walking to the youth hub. All of a sudden, she started spitting out some stuff that I had never heard before. So that's how you would get to know what's going on in their minds. So yeah, just take a walk with them. Yeah, take a walk with them.
Yeah, because what we tend to do is they come down to the office, or we go to them and we sit on the couch opposite.
Yeah.
And we've got to try not to do that at times, especially if they struggle to build relationships. You're right. I like that. That is a real golden nugget. Kim, I mean, you open up a can of worms, as I tell some of the other interviewees or guests, should I say, and we're going to have you back because it is really important. I think working on the front line and speaking to people on the other end of the phone, because we don't really get to meet you. Yeah. But here you are, and you've helped us understand what's going on. So I appreciate your time, Kim.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome.
Yeah, and guys, if you have any questions, just DM. By the way, Kim, I mean, I know what you do. You're a bit of a, besides singing, besides the ability to sing, I won't say any more about that. I did say that already. You have a Instagram page?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Actually, do you know what? I said to Kurt, I would give you this Instagram page, but actually, okay, so my personal Instagram is I am Kimberly Ruth. So I am, all one word, Kimberly, so K-I-M for mother, B for balloon, E-R-L-E-Y, Ruth, R-U-T-H. If you DM me on there about mental health stuff, you can feel free. I'm also a photographer. So I've got a photography page which you can access via my personal page in the bio, but it's K Sadler Photography. So K, S for sugar, A for alpha, double D for delta, L-E-R photography. And then just put that in Instagram, and then you find me there too.
And she is good. She is good. Yeah. She's got these lenses that are just like, what? I'll say no more about the lenses because I can't afford those lenses. But no, really, really appreciate the time with you. We'll see you soon. And guys, if you have any questions, just hit me up however you can on thesocialworkrace@gmail.com. Ask your questions and we can get those fired out onto the show and to other professionals. Look after yourself. See you soon.